it's an honor and a privilege to be asked to moderate this session today. It is an interesting one. It will hopefully pull together some of the previous themes. Our session for Cluster 3 is called Describing Possible Sustainable Futures. On the way over here, I kind of got panicked because I hadn't seen the detailed bio information, and then I remembered who the three speakers are, and they're all kind of dear, it turns out, all dear lifelong friends. So I said, the heck with reading that, I will just give very brief personal introductions. I'd also like to thank the organizers for putting a bio in for me that's 25 years old. It's a very humbling, necessarily humbling thing for John, as you might know. But with no humility at all, I'd like to say that our first speaker, I'm going to introduce the three speakers first. In my opinion, Nebojsa Nakicenovic is the leading expert on energy and environmental modeling and policy analysis in the entire world, if not the universe. So since I'm not being humble anymore, if you want to argue about that, I'll meet you outside after the session. And in fact, he's such a big international superstar, he's joined the ranks of single-named icons, Ronaldo, Angela, and my own personal favorite, Shakira. Arnold Grubler, also from IASA by way of a little-known East Coast Ivy League school these days, I claim, is a leading expert on technology change, especially in energy, environment, infrastructure issues, and now urban energy systems. And Hisham Zarafi, now at the UBC, or Hisham, I should say, at UBC is a world expert on energy access. Hisham will remember I met him because I said, is there any, this 10 years ago, is there any good papers or studies on smart grid? And I was told there was a very precocious Carnegie Mellon student named Hisham Zarafi who had written a microgrid paper, which I actually read. And then I tried to get follow-up work, and I called around the country, and he finally emailed me back and said, I'm over here at the program on energy and sustainability right across campus. Why don't you just walk over and pick up the sequels? So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Naki, aka Shakira, with a hit it. 5, 6, 7, 8.
Thank you, John. After this great introduction, my talk is going to be really boring compared to it. And I have to say, I feel really humbled because on top of it, not only did you overdo it, but also the talk is not mine, it's from Keivan. So I'm standing in here on Keivan Riahi, who is the convening lead author of this chapter. And I'm actually glad that he asked me to give this presentation because too many of us traveling over here is not exactly sustainable either from the point of view of emissions. But all of the errors are mine in the talk, and I think I've put also a little bit of biases on what to show from the chapter or not. This is the chapter 17 on energy pathways for sustainable development. As you can see, Keivan was the convening lead author, quite a large group of authors, and if you recognize some of the names, the resolution is not very high from the people who are here, and that is the reason is that this is an integrative chapter. Lots of information had to go from other chapters into here, and I also wanted to highlight at the bottom review editor. This is very important function, like in scientific journals. The review editors had the responsibility of making sure that the review comments have been properly handled by the authors. So it was a very important function in GAIA. That's why I listed also Granger here, who was responsible for this chapter. Now, let me go back to the slide I've shown this morning, a little bit of a continuity. There are a number of challenges for which indicators have been developed into global energy assessment. I'm highlighting here 4 that are very important for the pathways. And the basic idea, as you will see in a moment, was to understand transformational changes in the global energy and regional energy systems that would achieve sustainability in the sense of fulfilling this criteria for sustainable development in the future: energy access, climate change, energy security, and air pollution health impacts. Now, let me, since energy security is on the left and energy access is on the left and so important, in respect to Bob Schock's comments a little bit earlier, that the goal is 2050, it's a proof that this is a living document. In fact, I think the court made that statement this morning, we discovered it's a mistake in the key messages, so it'll have to join errata soon. Hopefully, of course, the full access will be maintained by 2050, but the original objective is to provide modern, sustainable cooking for all and minimum electricity services by 2030. So the energy goal, this is one central energy goal that has these various components to it, and this is why it was not all that easy to develop the pathways, and you will see in a second why the language was chosen that carefully. I mean, this was not a coincidental change in the terminology that we don't call the 41 ways of achieving sustainable development from the energy as an entry point. We don't call them scenarios. In principle, there are 3 scenarios, and 41 different ways of achieving them, and I will show that in a second. But the key features then of the sustainable future is the access, eliminating air pollution and health damages. You've heard from Kirk why this is so important, improving energy security, and I have to say I really enjoyed the discussion this morning in the panel about military forces being potentially a pioneer, and I actually believe it's true. We had about 3 years ago a stakeholder meeting before GEA was finished with the defense stakeholders and people from the Department of Defense, and it was really true. There was quite lots of discussion about revolutionizing energy in military, because also the paradigms have changed since the end of the Cold War. I mean, the kerosene that they have to carry for helicopters is exceedingly expensive. Tents that have to be left behind when the forces move are not environmentally good, and so there have been many ideas of how one could, for example, shift to more renewable local sources, on-site sources. And so there is, I think that it is, sometimes it's surprising which of the actors are the pioneers, and I believe here is a huge potential. And then, last but not least, the climate change, and we discussed it before, so I will not repeat it. Now, so one of the first, I think, important results of the global energy assessment that goes throughout many chapters, there are 4 chapters on access that I mentioned before, is to show the map of where people live who do not have access. And the color code is relatively simple. As you go from blue to red, the number of people that have to cook who do not have access to electricity increases. As you go from lighter to darker color, the number of people who have to cook with solid fuels increases. Total number is 3 billion cook with solid fuels, about 2.5 billion with wood, and biomass, about 500 million with coal. And I would say 1.5 billion do not have access to electricity, but the numbers have been going down in relative terms, but not in absolute terms. And the 2 circles identify the regions on which the pathways really focus to achieve full access in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia. That was a very important goal by 2030. And Sally and others have shown this. This is one of the other objectives, to achieve the stabilization at 2 degrees. That requires peak by 2020, huge reductions by the middle of the century, 30 to 70%. And if you're in the upper range, if you overshoot in quotes, then negative emissions are required. The pathways, for example, the red one, that's in the top of on the upper boundary as we go over the next 50 years, then has to dip deep into red in order to maintain the global carbon budget that's consistent with 2 degrees. So that requires negative emissions, and this is another really huge challenge. So basically the pathways are based on what I would call 3 scenarios. All 3 achieve these normative goals, but they come from different directions. And if we plot it on just 3 dimensions, cannot plot all of them. So if you have energy access on top, environmental issues and energy security, then there is a region somewhere in the middle that fulfills all of the goals. That's indicated by a dashed line. And there are 3 ways of basically approaching that. In green is a scenario that does that, among other measures, through very vigorous efficiency improvement. Then on the bottom, the red one is the one there is huge emphasis on supply options, less on efficiency, in particular in the end use, and the mix combines those. It's a kind of a middle of the road. So there are basically these different pathways of going there, and 41 scenarios, and then there are 41 pathways that achieve that. Just to give you a glimpse, there are also narratives that are described in the chapters that explain how that is happening. For example, on the left, the efficiency scenario has very high efficiency, rapid energy intensity improvements. On the supply side, massive supply side, upscaling, hydrogen as energy vector, a very cheap and affordable CCS, but clearly you need a price of carbon if you're going to have CCS. So these are some of the dimensions that the modeling teams had to consider in developing the scenarios. And let me show you how that flares out. I've shown you two cases this morning, just two, that are consistent with sustainable energy for all. Here is the case of an efficiency scenario, huge amount of avoidance of future energy use. As you can see, roughly about 50% by the middle of the century, 50% of renewables by the end of the century, and 50% renewables by the middle of the century. Phase out of oil, it says here necessary, not because we are extracting the last barrel, but because it's not consistent with an efficient energy structure, where mobility and other services have to be provided in a more efficient manner. And there is quite a lot of CCS here for both fossil energy technologies, but also for removing carbon from biomass. So CCS with bioenergy turns out to be quite an important role. Not all of the biomass goes in association with energy, because efficiency helps. It gives you the degrees of freedom that one doesn't have to push every single option to the limit. But in contrast to that, if you look at the supply, the other, I would say, extreme case, where most of the options are made in the energy system with very little behavioral and end-use changes, the efficiency is much more modest. That doesn't mean it's easier. It might be easier from current perspective. It doesn't mean it's easier, because you need huge scale-up of supply side. And there are many difficulties associated with that. As we know, as you can see, nuclear energy plays a very important role in many of those scenarios, whereas in efficiency we can have nuclear moratorium. Then renewables contribution is also very huge. You essentially have a large contribution across the band. So supply scenario itself might look more consistent with the current thinking, or with some of the business as usual studies, but it doesn't mean it's much easier to achieve. So they're altogether, in this sense, 41 pathways that achieve more sustainable future that have been explored. And I just wanted to show you what the variation is. And I think some of the important conclusions of GEA derive also from the variation across these pathways that build on the individual chapters, many of which have been already presented to you this morning. So again, I'm going back to the efficiency as it evolves, and then next to it, chopped up at 2050, next to it, how the system varies across various efficiency scenarios by 2015. And you can see what's common is huge amount of efficiency by definition. Then quite a lot of renewables, including bioenergy at the bottom in green. The oil plays a smaller role in these scenarios, but it is present there, as you can see in red, across the scenarios, as well as gas. And nuclear goes from very large to almost no nuclear. With a nuclear moratorium, only the current power plants would be then phased out. And let me just comment, that has been done before Fukushima. It was already in there as a kind of analysis of what are the options and the degrees of freedom. So across the scenarios, you can see quite a significant variation in the supply options, as I've tried to briefly explain. But there is also some variation across the end use. For example, colleagues have made stronger assumptions about the efficiency in transport, in mobility, more conservative assumptions in the conventional transportation. So that gives you also some indication of what the variation would be on both supply and end use side across the scenarios. The mix scenario scenario is shown here. Much less efficiency, nevertheless huge amount of renewables. In particular, bioenergy is very large in green, which might be problematic. Oil plays a more important role in these scenarios, as does the nuclear across many of the changes. We have also varied the end-use assumptions here. And then, I'm sorry, this was the mixed scenario, and then the supply scenario that has even less efficiency in it, much more humble efficiency, with even larger shares of the fossil energy, which means also larger shares of CCS later on to offset the overshooting of the emissions. So that gives you a little bit of an impression of the degrees of freedom are. I think the colleagues, one of the conclusions the colleagues have drawn, in particular in the efficiency scenario, it has so much robustness because of the efficiency. That's the benefit of efficiency. Then one or two technologies might not work out and it's still feasible. And I think that's a very important conclusion given the uncertainty about future technologies. Diana has shown this graph very briefly. End use is critical across all scenarios, not just in the efficiency scenario. For example, in industry, retrofitting needs to occur. It's not enough to wait for natural replacement of capital to achieve some of the ambitious goals. Life cycle of the product design has to change. Electrification of the industrial sector would be important. That's number 5. In the residential sector, you've heard from Diana, I will not report it, but also quite a lot of retrofitting and very rapid introduction of new building codes to reduce the energy requirements and make zero energy building sector. And then in transport, also very radical technology improvements, in particular in the efficiency scenarios. We have been looking at 50% improvement in the transport energy use, and also quite a lot of shift away from individual to collective transport to achieve this enormous efficiency improvements. I would like to conclude the presentation by, as I promised this morning, by saying a few things about investments at a higher degree of resolution than I did it this morning. This is just for orientation, the current situation, how the investments look like. 1.3 trillion worldwide, 40% going directly into electricity of those investments, about 30% upstream fossils, and about, as you can see, the other 30% going roughly in the demand efficiency components. And almost half of current investments are in the developing parts of the world, and the other half in the industrialized countries. And then directly the question came up this morning. I'm trying to illustrate that here. So the demand side investments might be on the order of 25%. However, depending how you account, for example, which part of the vehicle should be associated with the energy changes, it might be indeed as large as the end use might be as large as the total energy investment. If you have a perspective on the end use devices, that they are also important energy components and that more has to be done than just change the energy dimension. So I think that's directly in response to the question this morning. If we look over time, developing countries clearly overtake the investment needs of the industrialized countries. By the middle of the century, the investment in what we call now developing countries would be twice as high as in the now industrial parts of the world. So that there is also a changing dynamic, global dynamic here from the point of view of investments where they need to be made. I will finish in 1 minute. My watch is slightly different. It looks like I have a minute left, so I'll be very quick. China, very important. You see the investments as they evolve to 2050 from predominantly fossil investments today, and then by the end of the century in the supply scenario that will still tend to be in the fossils, but in the Gaia efficiency, the total investments are significantly lower, and what's the key is from about 200 billion would be going to the end use. So there is a major shift in the structure of the investments. Let me illustrate the same thing for sub-Saharan Africa, because that's where we have the highest challenges. By the middle of the century, investments in sub-Saharan Africa would be almost the same as in China. That's a huge challenge, and another 50% higher by the end of the century in the efficiency scenario. I will skip those two graphs in interest of time. Let me show you this one that I have as a conclusion that I've promised to show this morning, and I've just explained it. And I explained it, this is the cost in terms of GDP on the vertical scale. Security itself would be about 0.2%, as I mentioned this morning. Air pollution and health about 0.5%, and climate in the order of less than 1%. But if you add all of those together in an integrated policy, as the scenarios do, then one of the derivative analyses is that the cost of meeting all of the three objectives would be only marginally above of what it would cost to meet the first two objectives by themselves or climate change by itself. So thank you. I'll finish here. This is a database where you can download all of the information and many things I didn't have a chance to present.